It seems that just about anyone who is anyone has had a part to play in a Marvel movie. Just look at the climactic battle in Avengers Endgame. But of course, that's just not true. And despite the popularity of the franchise, many actors have flat out said no to joining the MCU or left the franchise altogether. From Emily Blunt to Jason Momoa, there are a bunch of great actors who just passed on one of the most popular franchises on the planet. Bear in mind that for this list, we'll be looking at all the Marvel films, not just the MCU.
Wow, that's beautiful. That's great. What'd you do wrong?
We all know the 2003 Daredevil film was a bit rough. Even leading man Ben Affleck declared he hated the film in a 2016 interview. But as it turns out, Ben wasn't the man who was first offered the role of the Man Without Fear. That honor, if you want to call it that, would go to his friend and Good Will Hunting co-writer, Matt Damon. Like Ben Affleck, Matt Damon was a fan of the old Daredevil comics as a kid and was very intrigued with the possibility of playing the character on the big screen. What ultimately made him pass on the role, despite his love of the character, was what he would cite as a weak script and an unfamiliarity with the director. Damon was able to take his love of the character out of the equation and passed on the role. But his friend Ben couldn't do that as he loved the character too much. You know what was good casting? Chris Pratt as Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord in the Guardians of the Galaxy films. He was goofy, lovable, and a moron. Pratt straight up owns the role, and you'd think that he was born to play it, but the actor who once liked to hang out in Parks and Recreation wasn't even Marvel's first choice for the role. As it turns out, it was Joseph Gordon-Levitt who was being eyed by Marvel to bring Star-Lord to life. But despite Marvel being interested in him, he wasn't so interested in the role over at Marvel. This was because another role had caught his eye, that being the new character Johnny for the upcoming Sin City sequel. In a surprise twist, Chris Pratt also initially turned down the role of Star-Lord, citing his shape and weight, but he eventually got on board and got in shape, giving us one of the most memorable characters in the MCU. She would later join the MCU in Doctor Strange as Christine Palmer, but Marvel was eyeing Rachel McAdams long before things got strange in the MCU. It was revealed that McAdams was actually offered the role of Pepper Potts for the Iron Man films. That means that Rachel McAdams could have shown up in Endgame as Rescue. She ultimately didn't get the role, however, whether due to her audition or her interest is unknown, but she seemed to still be invested in the comings and goings of the MCU to try and pursue it again. Do you think McAdams would have been a better Pepper Potts, or did they get it right with Paltrow? It seems to be an undisputed truth that if you're a celebrated athlete, you can also get some acting done. This was particularly true in the 2010s when UFC was at an all-time high. Fighters like George St. Pierre showed up in Winter Soldier, while Ronda Rousey played a role in Furious 7. Despite eventually landing a role in the A-Team remake, Rampage Jackson was actually a studio favorite to join this franchise. The film in question was X-Men Origins Wolverine, the first in a line of would-be origin films. Fox wanted Jackson to play the role of Wraith, a mutant who ran a boxing gym, making Jackson an ideal candidate. Unfortunately for all parties involved, Jackson had a fight coming up and couldn't divide his time between training and shooting, so he had to pass on the role, which ultimately went to Will.i.am. The movie, as we know, was not very well received, so perhaps Jackson dodged a bullet there.
Y'all don't know what y'all messing with!
With the benefit of hindsight, this would have been a weird combination, and we wouldn't have gotten one of the best movies of 2019 if this panned out. Marvel has repeatedly been trying to court Joaquin Phoenix to join the MCU in some capacity. At first, he was a studio favorite to play Bruce Banner, otherwise known as the Hulk. He passed on this and would pass on the studio yet again when it came time to cast for the lead role in Doctor Strange. When asked why he kept turning Marvel down, he said he thought the roles would ultimately not be fulfilling. Clearly, he saw the role of the Joker to be much more challenging and rewarding. The role would net him a Best Actor statue at the 2020 Golden Globes. Due to the competitive nature of the studios, it would be very unlikely that Phoenix would have been in the MCU and been the lead in a DC movie, and we're very grateful he chose Joker, as all parties involved in their Marvel roles own it, as Phoenix did with Joker. Despite owning the role, Scarlett Johansson wasn't actually Marvel's first choice to play the Black Widow in the MCU. When the character was first introduced in Iron Man 2, the studio was initially hoping that Emily Blunt would be the big one to interact with Tony Stark on the big screen. What's even more surprising is that Emily Blunt had initially said yes to the role and that Johansson had lost out on the role. So what happened? Well, scheduling conflicts came up. Blunt had already signed on to do another movie, the 2010 Gulliver's Travels with Jack Black and Jason Segel. Since she was already committed to one job, she had to turn down Black Widow, despite the potential of being in a Marvel movie. She's cool with this though. At the time, she cited that the men had better stories in the MCU and didn't feel the story was too great for the character. Of course, now the MCU is being more diverse, and Black Widow has a solo movie coming out in 2020. Giancarlo Esposito may be the single greatest threat to Baby Yoda right now and is known for being one of the most memorable villains in television with his portrayal of Gus in Breaking Bad, but he was also in consideration to join the MCU at one point. In fact, it was Esposito who was actively pursuing a role in Marvel, any role, because he thought that what they were doing was great by 2016. After speaking with Marvel, they seemingly were on board with his passion and signed him up for an undisclosed role in a Marvel TV show. We may never know what role he was offered, but one of the key factors in Esposito's refusal of the role was knowing it was a television role and not a film role. Seeing that the TV characters don't make their way to the big screen, he wanted to hold out. He, however, did not apply this rule when it came time for The Mandalorian. In the early 2000s, Josh Hartnett was the Hollywood heartthrob. Everyone wanted to have him in their movies after the financial success of films like Black Hawk Down and Pearl Harbor. With that in mind, Hartnett was actually in consideration for multiple superhero roles, all of which he turned down. He was one of the favorites to play Peter Parker in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man movies. His reason for this was that he didn't want to be pigeonholed into a certain role type for the rest of his career, fearing he'd be expected to do big blockbusters forever. Likewise, he also turned down the roles of Superman for Superman Returns and Batman for Christopher Nolan. We don't think there's anyone who turned down 3 different superhero roles in their careers, let alone 3 of the biggest characters. But Josh would later go on to co-star in Penny Dreadful, and who knows if he would have if he was a superhero.
You gotta leave him wanting more.
All right. Let's talk about how awesome yet how weird it'd be to see Matthew McConaughey in a superhero film. The actor is one of the most sought after in the biz, so naturally, studios wanted him to bring his A-game to their features. Both DC and Marvel have approached McConaughey about doing a superhero film for them. For Marvel, he was in consideration to play Ego, the living planet in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. He told them no, however, but did suggest that they give Kurt Russell a call, which they clearly did, and he clearly said yes. When asked why he turned it down, he cited the growing popularity of the franchise, and the studio's desire to bring big-name actors into the films would make him feel like an amendment. While McConaughey usually avoids blockbustery movies, we still would like to see him show up in a Marvel flick one day, even if it's a cameo. You know what made a lot of money and is fondly remembered by the fans? The Deadpool movie. You know what isn't as fondly remembered by the fans? X-Men Apocalypse. But aside from mutants, what is the common denominator between those 2 movies? The answer to that is Olivia Munn. Despite being known as Psylocke in the X-Men films, Munn was actually offered the role of Vanessa in the Deadpool movie. The reason for turning down the role is simple. Vanessa wasn't a superhero, whereas Psylocke had powers. Munn wasn't content in playing the eye candy to a male protagonist, and wanted to be someone who has a more spectacular impact on the narrative in terms of raw power. Psylocke definitely wasn't any sort of side character to any male character. There's no doubt that, of all the Marvel characters out there in the MCU, Robert Downey Jr. was seemingly born to play the role of Tony Stark. He just owns it, right? You can't picture anyone else playing him, right? Well, turns out Jon Favreau did imagine someone else playing Stark, and that actor was none other than Sam Rockwell. Rockwell went in and did the audition and was a favorite to play the character, until Downey Jr. came in to audition for the role, of course. Despite not being offered the role of Tony Stark at the end of the day, Favreau was still impressed with Rockwell's audition and kept him in mind when it came to cast the part of the villainous Justin Hammer in Iron Man 2. Props to Favreau for ensuring that a favorite candidate of his still was able to collaborate in the future. Speaking of actors who just straight up own their respective roles, when it comes to Wolverine, it's Hugh Jackman. Without a doubt, he's the only Australian who can play a Canadian hero that many people think is actually American, only that was almost not the case. Want to take a guess at who was initially offered the role of Wolverine in the original X-Men movie? We'll give you a hint. His name is Russell Crowe. Crowe, however, didn't end up taking the job, citing his character in Gladiator, Maximus, used a wolf totem and didn't have to have too many wolves going on in his movies. Yeah, okay there, Russell.
Are you not entertained?
He also cited that Wolverine and the X-Men were cartoons and didn't see himself playing such a character. He did, however, suggest to Bryan Singer that they go with Hugh Jackman, so we can all thank Crowe for that one. Jessica Chastain may be part of the Marvel canon now, thanks to her involvement with the critical and commercial failure X-Men Dark Phoenix, but the role actually wasn't her first attempt at being part of the Marvel family. So while Ant-Man has a big profile feature in the MCU, no pun intended, the role of Wasp was actually almost given to Chastain before it went to Evangeline Lilly. This was all the way back when Edgar Wright was calling the shots on the movie. This wasn't the only role Chastain would pass up on for the MCU. She also turned away from working opposite Downey Jr. in Iron Man 3 due to scheduling conflicts. She actually confirmed her involvement and busy schedule on a Facebook post to her fans, apologizing for any confusion and mishap to her fans. That role would ultimately go to Rebecca Hall, and Chastain technically still has not joined the MCU. Chris Evans is fortunate enough to have played two different superheroes at two very different points in his career. Before lacing up as Captain America, you might remember he was Johnny Storm in the Fantastic Four films. Interestingly, the part of Rogers may have been given to someone else entirely, locking him out of such a feat. Can you imagine 2011 John Krasinski donning the shield of Captain America? It's hard to do, but it almost happened. The role of Steve Rogers ultimately went to Evans thanks in part to his familiarity with comic book movies like Fantastic Four and Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. But if Krasinski did join the MCU, he likely wouldn't have been able to do A Quiet Place and its upcoming sequel, The Jack Ryan Show, or continue on with The Office, and let's be real, we got spoiled with Krasinski over the last decade and a bit. We think it's safe to say that X-Men First Class surprised a lot of fans, especially after Origins and The Last Stand. Part of what made it so good was the cast, which included Kevin Bacon as Sebastian Shaw. But another heavy hitter almost landed that part. The actor in question was none other than Bryan Cranston. Yeah, Walter White himself was almost in a Marvel movie. So why didn't he do it? He wanted to do Drive instead, the smaller crime film starring Ryan Gosling that has gone on to become a cult favorite. Considering Cranston was already a few seasons into Breaking Bad, we can totally imagine him channeling that energy into Sebastian Shaw. Again, no pun intended. Do you think Cranston made the right call here, or would he have been better served in First Class? We personally love Drive and what Kevin Bacon delivered, so we have no complaints on our end. When it comes to the character Odin, a classically trained actor just seems so right for such a stoic and wise character who is also deeply flawed, which is why Anthony Hopkins totally owns the role. But he wasn't the studio's first choice when it came to playing Odin in the Thor movie. In a weird reveal, Mel Gibson was also up for the part of Odin. Gibson has done his fair share of great roles, such as William Wallace in Braveheart and Max Rockatansky in the Mad Max films, but began to go off the deep end a bit in more recent years. When asked why he turned down the role in an interview with The Guardian, Gibson had this and only this to say on the matter, quote, "I didn't do it. Yes, we can see that, Mel, but why? We don't think Mel Gibson would have been a good fit for the role of Odin."
Leave me alone.
Zoe Saldana is one of those actresses who owns her role in the MCU, making Gamora her own, which makes it hard to imagine that someone else could play the role, but that very nearly happened. Being a more obscure property at the time, Marvel wanted to swing for the fences when it came time to cast for their Guardians of the Galaxy movie. For the part of Gamora, Olivia Wilde was one of the early favorites to play the green-skinned assassin. Wilde ultimately turned down the part, citing her busy schedule. She had 7 roles come out in 2013, which is when the first Guardians movie was filming, so it stems to reason that yes, she was really busy. But it all worked out in the end as Marvel eventually hired Saldana, and the rest, as you can say, is history. Do you think Wilde could have been a great Gamora, or did they luck out with Saldana? Let us know. You may all know the name Chris Hemsworth now, but when he landed the role of Thor, God of Thunder, he was a relative unknown at the time, appearing briefly in Star Trek and The Perfect Getaway, for example, which says something about his audition. When you consider, the studio almost went with a much bigger actor at the time. He may not have landed the role, but True Blood and Big Little Lies actor Alexander Skarsgard was actually in close running to play Thor, which would have been cool knowing that he'd be sharing the big screen with his dad, Stellan Skarsgard. In the end, it was Marvel who decided not to continue working with Skarsgard, preferring what Hemsworth brought to the table for the character. Do you think Skarsgard would have been a good Thor, or did Marvel get it right with Hemsworth? Hey, let us know. We spoke already how Sam Rockwell was high up on the list of studio favorites to play Tony Stark, but there is more to this story than meets the eye. Marvel had sold the rights to many of their characters in order to keep their studio alive. Knowing that Iron Man could one day happen, the studio began working on concepts and drafts early on in hopes of an Iron Man movie one day being a real possibility. This promise movie went through a lot of writers, and one of the producers attached to it back in the day was none other than Tom Cruise, who was also on board to star as Tony Stark. But that was a long time ago, and the actor eventually got bored with waiting for the rights to revert, so despite his early involvement, he was never really close to being Iron Man. Jason Momoa has come a long way since his days on Baywatch Hawaii. After the success of Game of Thrones, he was naturally approached by a lot of studios. One of those was Marvel, who sought the Dothraki warrior for one of their upcoming projects. Can you guess which one? It'd be interesting to see how it could have turned out, but Jason Momoa was actually considered for the role of Drax in the Guardians of the Galaxy films. He turned down the role because he thought a brutish character who used physical violence was too similar to Khal Drogo and Conan the Barbarian. As we know though, fortune favors the bold, and it wasn't long before Momoa was offered another superhero role, that of Aquaman. The benefit of this role, which he took, was that he would also get his own starring film, which turned out to be one of the most popular DCEU films. Who would have thought it?
Good night, tiny humans.
Those are 20 actors who got away or passed up to play a part in a Marvel movie. Who do you think Marvel got spot on with their casting? And who of these actors do you wish got a chance to join a Marvel movie? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in your playlist every day. Thanks for watching.